Okay, so let's begin with the word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are so very thankful for the way that you can work upon our hearts. And we know, Lord, that there are many who are looking for truth. And we just ask, Lord, that as we study this morning, we can be among that class, that we can set aside our preconceptions, our biases, our prejudices, our emotions, and that we can see your hand in the study of prophecy, that we can see and feel the things that we need to, that are sanctified, and that human emotion and human sight will not predominate. We ask, Lord, that you can be with each person as we begin this study, which in some ways is a bit off the track of what we've been doing in examining the foundation, but really is an examination of the foundation of this message in a way that helps us understand how you led us in the past and how you are leading us now. We ask for your Holy Spirit to be our teacher, to guide in the study, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, good morning, everyone. So this week we're going to be doing a study on the November 22nd, 2018 prediction. Now, as many people know, that study was suppressed right from the very beginning, and we had no idea why. So at the time, we were sort of flabbergasted of what was happening. We didn't know what was happening behind the scenes. Now, we do know to some degree, but the one thing that I never like to do is speculate or guess about what people were doing or thinking. I don't like to read people's minds. All I can do is tell of my experience. And part of what we're going to do as we look at this in this first study is what Heidi and I had studied, and what we thought was significant about it. And then we're going to look at what came from that there was, as we continue to study the Civil War, what came from that. Now, as we go through the study, we will see that this is really connected to the 2520 and to the events in the Civil War that occurred with ancient Israel in 742 BC, and also to the American Revolution, and to what we could, I guess, parallel with the American Revolution. That would be the dividing of the kingdom of Israel in 977 BC. So there's all these different connections with things that we already understand about prophecy and about Bible prophecy that came to play upon this movement in 2018. Now, we have, so just before we get into the papers and into the study, I do want to illustrate some of this. So I'm going to go to the whiteboard here. Let's hang on a sec. So one of the things that we have always understood in this message, at least for a long time, is that you have 742 BC. And 742 BC is the beginning of the prophetic mirror. It gives us a period of 19 years going to 723. And we know that we have this 1798 And this 1798 is when America rises, according to Ellen White in The Great Controversy. So Ellen White is tying this history, which is the result of the American Revolution. Now, if we go to 677 and 1844, how are these two 2520s related?
You have a 65-year time prophecy.
Okay, so they're related by this 65-year time prophecy. So that means here you have this period of 65 years. And we know that in 1863, we also have this period of 65 years. And that gives us this prophetic mirror of 2,604 years. Now, we know that in this history, there's a civil war. And in this history, there's a civil war. So that means for this movement, for a long time, we've understood the significance of the Civil War in 1863. And the reason that the church was organizing had to do with the Civil War, in part, in that in order to avoid the draft, they needed to have an organized church. It made it a lot easier. Now, we also know that prior to this Civil War, in 977 BC, we have the division of North and South occurs. So in order to have this civil war over here, you have to have the kingdom of Israel divided into the North and the South. Now, when we looked at 977 BC, and as we're going to see, there was a significant event in 977 that the Bible records that we used in connection with Ezekiel chapter 4 in the prophecy of the 390 years and the 40 years. And that event was a counterfeit feast day on the 15th day of the 8th month. And this became a symbol of the midnight cry. I mean, not because of this. It was a symbol of the midnight cry because of August 15th, 1844. So this becomes a symbol, though, that's in this history. And a lot was made of this. Jeff spent a lot of time in 2020 going through this, talking about this connection. And what we were doing in 2018, because that's where we're going to go back to, is we had understood that there was, and if just for the sake of simplicity, we'll call this a revolution, and we call this a civil war. So we know that in this history, we have a revolution as well, the American Revolution, and we have this civil war. And one of the things that in 2018 that we were looking at was the French, the German, and the Russian revolutions and civil wars. So the question was, why couldn't we look at the American? Now, in a sense, we already had looked at the American Revolution because Jeff was presenting that and aspects of that, the rise of America, at the camp meeting in October of 2018. Does anybody know what significant event happened on November 9th? I'm trying to think of the year. with connection with the Mayflower.
I think it was 1620.
Yeah, I'm trying to. Yeah, I think it was 1620.
1612, the spotting of land.
Okay, 1612. Okay. Okay, so
No, I don't think it was 1612. I think it
1612.
was I think it was 1620.
I think so too. 1620 seems okay. Well, we'll say it's 16 question.
Well, it was the spotting of land.
And that has to do with the place called Cape Cod, right?
Correct.
Okay, so they spot this. And so Jeff had brought this out, and he also dealt with some of the history, the early American history in connection with this. Now, we sort of came across this, the Civil War and a study of it by accident. Obviously, it was God's providence. And that is, Heidi had a book lent to her about the visions of Ellen White, or maybe it was about Ellen White, Women of Vision or something like that, which is a book written where it goes through lots of different visions that Ellen White had. And one of the visions that it's going to deal with specifically was Ellen White's second Civil War vision. And this became really significant in the context of this movement. Now, one of the things, I really want to note here is this connection with the past, where this movement was going, what it was looking at, and what it was connecting to, and how we were trying to understand where we were in history, where we were in prophetic history, based upon the fact that we had this November 9th prediction. And it only happened a few weeks before, maybe about, I guess maybe 5 or 6 weeks before we entered into this study on the American Civil War. Now, this is the study that we did at that time. We presented this at a prayer meeting, and Heidi ended up presenting part of it, and I presented the rest. And I have Heidi's notes where I laid it out a little bit differently than this, but this is, now it was not, they were not allowed to record it. So this seemed to us not to really make sense. It seemed, yeah, and just a note there in the chat regarding 1620 is correct. And Jeff was relating this to the 2016 election. That is, he was taking these two numbers and inverting them. So there was also a connection with the election of Donald Trump, and which becomes significant as well. So we were looking at what was happening in the present time, that we were in a civil war in the United States. And we still believe that in this movement, that there is a civil war going on in the United States. And so to connect back to these other civil wars definitely seems appropriate. Now, I'm going to sort of read through this, and because we're going to be taking our time going through this process. And back then I didn't know as much as I know now, because we are in a sense setting into this study quite naively. Now looking back as I've gone through the study, looked at some of my notes, looked at my diagrams, there's definitely things I did not notice. And also things that I would say were mistakes or that is because I didn't see some things. The things that I was seeing weren't necessarily wrong. They were just incomplete. And that if I would have known what I know now, I would have seen things quite differently. So anyway, we will lay out the line of the American Civil War that ran for over 4 years, from April 12th, 1861 to May 9th, 1865. Now, there is also on April 9th, 1865, there was a surrender that occurred. So, in some ways, when it comes to the dating of the end of the Civil War, a person could say it's sort of arbitrary. You have to pick what event you decide is the end of the war. And there's sometimes debate about that, how you end something like a war, because the battles have stopped, and then there's just kind of an official point at which they declare that the war has ended. But as far as even starting a war, sometimes that can be a little sketchy of what you decide. Do you decide, the first battle, or do you decide when somebody declares war, even if there isn't a battle yet? All those types of things. But these are the dates that we would generally find for the American Civil War: April 12th, 1861 to May 9th, 1865. Okay. Interesting point in the chat. Angela says, depending how we calculate it, the Mayflower voyage was 63 to 64 days. So it was from September 6th to November 9th, 1620. So interesting. Now we know that September 7th is the significant date in which Jeff speaks, presents a meeting that opposes the Omega, and that's going to mark a period of 63 days that ends on November 9th, 2019. So so this is a pivotal period in both American history and in the rise of the Adventist Church. Ellen White had 3 visions about the war. The first occurred on January 12th, 1861, 90 days before the beginning of the war, on April 12th, 1861. So there's this period of 90 days. Her second vision, which we will address first, was on August 3rd, 1861, 113 days after the start of the war, and exactly 29 weeks after her first vision. Her third and final vision occurred 51 weeks after her first vision on January 4th, 1862. Now, she's having these visions on Sabbaths, so that's why they can be exactly a certain number of weeks apart. Now, the first vision, and this was because Heidi had noticed this, and it struck her, and it led to our study of the Civil War. And this is the second vision. Now, she was attending a conference in Roosevelt, New York. Ellen White was taken off into vision to the scene of the Battle of Manassas, also known as the First Battle of Bull Run, that occurred 13 days previously. She was shown God's hand in what took place there. So 13 days after this battle, Ellen White is going to have this vision. She says, I had a view of the late disastrous battle at Manassas. What's VA stand for again? Is that
Virginia.
Virginia?
Yeah, Virginia.
Okay, I always have trouble with these American abbreviations of the states. It was a most exciting, thrilling, distressing scene. The Southern Army had everything in their favor and were prepared for a dreadful contest. The Northern Army was moving on with triumph, not doubting, but that they would be victorious. Many were reckless and marched forward boastingly as though victory were already theirs. As they neared the battlefield, many were almost fainting through weariness and want of refreshment. They did not expect so fierce an encounter. They rushed into battle and fought bravely, desperately. The dead and dying were on every side. Both the North and the South suffered severely. The Southern men felt the battle, and in a little would have been driven back still further. Northern men were rushing on, although their destruction was very great. Just then, an angel descended and waved his hand backward. Instantly, there was confusion in their ranks. It appeared to the northern men that the armies were retreating, when it was not in reality so, and a precipitate retreat commenced. It seemed wonderful to me. Then it was explained that God had this nation in his own hand and would suffer no victories to be gained faster than he ordained, and no more losses to the northern men than in his wisdom he saw fit to punish the North for their sin. In this battle, had the northern army pushed the battle still further, in their fainting, exhausted condition, a far greater struggle and destruction awaited them, which it would have caused great triumph in the south. God would not permit this, and sent an angel to interfere. The sudden falling back of the northern troops was a mystery to all. They knew not that God's hand was in the matter. So what are some things that would strike you about this vision?
The general picture of the carnage
Okay.
would be one item, but the fact, I mean, the Northern Army at that time was still somewhat better organized, though those in the South were much better marksmen.
Yeah. So you had the North was much more organized. They had greater numbers. And this Civil War, I mean, it's lots written about it, and I'm not an expert on the Civil War. But I do know that it really was not a typical war to that time of how they had done things. And part of that is the American Revolution had started to change warfare a little bit. I mean, we know in the past they used to just take armies, line them up, and then basically see how many you could kill off the other people without being killed off yourself. Sort of like a big arm wrestle in some ways compared to how war is done now, which is, it's quite different. So the people in the South were fighting a little bit differently than, and especially we saw this with the British and the Americans. The way that the British were fighting, the Americans were fighting was different. So this continued off into the Civil War. I know some of that, but I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. But one of the things that strikes me is that this is 13 days after. Now, we have, 150 years basically of analysis of this war and this battle. But Ellen White nails it 13 days after. And if you think about the way that news travels and the types of rumors and stories that go around regarding events, this is highly unlikely that Ellen White, as just a normal person, is going to get this war correct, this battle correct. Because there would be all kinds of stories about what happened. But she's describing something that the historians still accept. And I find that quite interesting. Now, of course, we have another symbol, which we wouldn't have understood back in November. But this is the period of 13 days. And we're going to see that these periods of time, even as I marked them out back in 2018, become quite significant. So I'm just going to see if this works. Do this. Now, I'm just going to lay this out, and we're going to look at this. This isn't going to work too well because it's not going to show the whole thing. You have to look at it like this. So just hang on. Okay, so we're going to examine this a lot more closely. I'm just going to zoom in over here so we can see this part of it. So what we can see is that there is 90 days from Ellen White's first vision to the start of the war. And then we're going to see 100 days from, and I have some things written up there, some symbols, just kind of ignore those for now. Now, the thing about the start of the Civil War is it begins on April 12th, 1861. We're going to look at that when I go through these things. And there's 100 days, and then there's 13 days. Now, 100 days is 144,000 minutes, and 13 days is 18,720 minutes. So those become significant symbols. We're also going to see the period of 22 weeks, 51 weeks, dealing with all these visions, and 29 weeks from her first vision to her second, which isn't explicitly written out here. So these spans of time become significant. Now, another thing is this war or this battle occurs on what date?
What we were just addressing was that it looks like this begins about July 21st.
Yeah, so the battle is on July 21st. Okay. So,
Now-
so when, and I haven't said that yet in this account, and Ellen White doesn't mention that, but you can see there's this August 3rd, 1861. That's going to be 13 days after July 21st. And that's the day that the battle occurred. Yeah, you have a comment there.
Okay, as we're looking at all of this right now, I pulled up some details, and I was struck by something quickly,
Okay.
because first off, the Northern Army was a group of what they called 90-day volunteers. These are all men that volunteered to serve in the Army for 90 days. They had no military experience. But the general that they sent down, when he was going toward Manassas, or Bull Run, as they also call this battle,
Mhm.
he reached a village that's called Centerville on July 18th. And so 5 miles ahead was this stream that was named Bull Run, that crossed the route of the Union advance,
Mhm.
and was there guarding the fords from the Union Mills to the Stone Bridge, where waited 22,000 Southern troops under the command of Pierre G.T. Beauregard. So I'm looking at this because there were 35,000 Northern troops, 22,000 Southern troops, but it was July 18th that they first had a bit of a skirmish before the July 21 battle.
Yeah, so the symbol of 3 days before midnight.
Right.
Mhm. And of course, July 18th as a symbolic date. And so back then, that wouldn't have meant anything to me in November of 2018. Well, maybe it would have, because we already have the July 18th prediction. But I wasn't looking for that structure yet.
But it's also that they were having to cross a stream.
Okay. And the crossing the stream.
Well, I mean, in this situation, could we apply this as crossing the river of life, because there were so many of these Northern troops that didn't make it back?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of details here that, like, there's so many details about this battle. And this is called the first battle of Bull Run. There is also a second battle of Bull Run. And I can't remember, I know the North and the South names the battles differently. So one side names it based upon the town that it's next to. The other one names it based on the body of water that it's next to. And we had a similar thing with William Miller in 1814.
Right.
When he, it's the Battle of Lake Champlain, but it's also called, what's the other name for the battle?
Plattsburgh.
Plattsburgh, right? So Plattsburgh's the city, Lake Champlain's the body of water. And so I'm not sure why this is, that the North and the South name the battles differently, just like the British and the Americans did. And maybe there's some significance in this that I don't understand, but it's just a fact and something that you always have to take into account, that you have to notice if you're going to know about these battles.
Now, here's another point that's interesting, because the troops commanded by Beauregard, he appealed for additional troops, and the government at Richmond sent General Joseph E. Johnson from the Shenandoah Valley with 10,000 additional troops. So we're talking about 32,000 Southern troops against 35,000 Northern troops.
Mhm.
So the attack on the morning of July 21st began at about 5:30 a.m.
Okay.
Sort of reminds me of Gideon.
Right.
He had 32,000, and it was down to 22. Or sorry, 22 came off, and then it was down to 10.
Okay.
Good point.
Now, Iran just said Bull Run Manassas equals 187. That is that the gematria of Bull Run and Manassas together? Yes. So Iran says that. So if we just take the English gematria of Bull Run and Manassas, you put those words in a gematria calculator, you'll get 187.
Didn't we figure that out before? I can't remember.
It sounds familiar.
It does, yeah.
Yeah. And so, and lots of these details, because we haven't spent a lot of time on this. So some of the things that we may have noticed in the past, we might discover again, not remembering that we noticed them. Now, of course, the other part of this is God's hand. And this is one of the things that Miller on September 11th, 1814 noticed at the Battle of Lake Champlain, or the Battle of Plattsburgh, is that as a deist who believed that there was a God who made things, but wasn't interested in humanity, he saw God's hands, God's providence in the victory that happened there. And so this was the thing that led him, in part, to come to study God's word. Now it's going to be 2 years later to the day that he's going to begin this course of study. So he puts it off for 2 years, and it's not until a preacher comes to celebrate this battle, or it's the second anniversary of this battle, that he then begins that period of 2 years of study that ends in 1818. But definitely what happened to him on September 11th, 2014, was his recognition of God's hand. And Ella White is showing this quite clearly.
1814.
Yeah, didn't I say 1814?
I think you said 1818.
1818, he finishes his 2 years of study. 1814, September 11th, is when the Battle of Plattsburgh happens. And it's September 11th, 1816, that they have this sermon that's preached. They were going to have a ball that night. And because of the conviction brought by this sermon, they canceled the celebration. So anyway, we have September 11th marked there. And now here we have, in this battle, we have another waymark marked, that is July 21st. And also we have July 18th connected to it 3 days before. So these battles then are significant in their prophetic symbolism. But also Ellen White's visions and her connection to what's happening also gives significance to this battle, because Ellen White has a vision about it and she marks it. Now, another thing is, when you're dealing with history happening, trying to decide the significance of any particular battle while these battles are going on is much more difficult than to look back 50 years later and decide what events in a war, what battles in a war were significant. And this battle is considered very significant historically. So it wasn't just one of the battles that happened. It's a significant battle. And Ellen White in Vision is noticing this. Because there's lots of battles. If you go through Wikipedia and all the different battles that happen. So she would have no way of knowing 13 days after if this is a significant battle in this war, unless she's directed by God to do so. And this is a significant battle near the start of the war. It's one of the things that allows the war to continue longer than it would have. Because you see, at the time, the North just believes that they're going to defeat the South. And they go really to this battle unprepared for what they're going to experience. So in a sense, it's going to be the first major battle. Now, we're going to look at some of the eyewitness accounts. There were several eyewitness accounts of the battle. And these agree with Sister White's accounts, except that the cause of the retreat was to them a mystery. So you're going to have W.W. Blackford, who was a lieutenant colonel in the Southern Army, give an account of what happened at Manassas in the Battle of July 21st, 1861. He says, "It was about 4 o'clock, and the battle raged with unabated fury. The lines of blue were unbroken, and their fire vigorous as ever, while they surged against the solid walls of gray, standing immovable in their front. It was on that ridge earlier in the day that Jackson won the name of Stonewall. But now the most extraordinary spectacle I've ever witnessed took place. I'd been gazing at the numerous well-formed lines as they moved forward to the attack, some 15 or 20,000 strong in full view, and for some reason had turned my head in another direction for a moment when someone exclaimed, pointing to the battlefield, 'Look, look.' I looked, and what a change had taken place in an instant. Where those well-dressed, well-defined lines with clear spaces between had been steadily pressing forward, the whole field was a confused swarm of men, like bees, running away as fast as their legs could carry them, with all order and organization abandoned. In a moment more, the whole valley was filled with them as far as the eye could reach. They plunged through Bull Run wherever they came to it, regardless of fords or bridges, and there many were drowned. Muskets, cartridge boxes, belts, knapsacks, haversacks, and blankets were thrown away in their mad race, that nothing might impede their flight. In the reckless haste, the artillery drove over everyone who did not get out of their way. Ambulance and wagon drivers cut the traces and dashed off on the mules. In their crossing of Cub Run, a shell exploded in a team and blocked the way, and 28 pieces of artillery fell into our hands." So, I mean, you can definitely see that he's not aware of what happened, but all of a sudden there's this precipitous retreat. And we know from the spirit of prophecy that this was an angel that caused this. And any thoughts on this before we go?
Well, as you were reading that, I pulled up another portion of this one article that describes us on this battle. And it says, about noon, the Federals stopped their advance to reorganize for a new attack. The lull lasted for about an hour, giving Confederates enough time to reform their lines. Then the fighting resumed, each side trying to force the other off Henry Hill. The battle continued until just after 4 p.m. when fresh Southern units crashed into the Union right flank on Chin Ridge, causing McDowell's tired and discouraged soldiers to withdraw. At first, the withdrawal was orderly, screened by the regulars. The 3-month volunteers retired across Bull Run, where they found the road to Washington jammed with the carriages of congressmen and others that had driven out from Centerville to watch the fight. Panic now seized many of the soldiers, and the retreat became a rout. The Confederates, bolstered by the arrival of President Jefferson Davis on the field just as the battle was ending, were too disorganized to follow up on their success. Daybreak on July 22nd found the defeated Union Army back behind the bristling defenses of Washington.
Yeah, now, I've read quite a few different accounts of this. Now, this is one account which I had read. I don't know, where'd you get that account?
I'm looking at nps.gov, First Manasseh.
Okay.
I can send you the source if you want.
Yeah, because I remember reading that account. Now, they're sort of trying to explain, almost give a reason for what happened in some ways. I mean, they're doing a retreat, but the panic that ensued really isn't explainable on that.
Exactly.
Right. But they are trying to give some kind of a reason, and but that wouldn't just happen. I mean, you're going to constantly have people retreating in a battle. You're not always going to have them pressing forward. They're going to have to back up and so forth. So that this turned into a general panic is still a mystery, other than that we know why. Now, here is an account of Brother Josh Johnson. So now, J.N. Loughborough is one of the persons who actually he recorded Ellen White's first Civil War vision, and sort of kept track of a lot of this dealing with the Civil War. So it was to him an interest because he was there when she gave her first Civil War vision, I believe, and he recorded it. So without him recording it, we actually wouldn't have a record of her first Civil War vision. I stood not for, so this is this Brother Johnson, and this is published in the Pacific Union Recorder, March 21st, 1912. I stood not 4 rods from General Beauregard when that stampede began. Beauregard had their cannons loaded with chain shot and was about to fire. He looked toward the advancing host and cried out, "The Yanks are all retreating. Don't fire the guns." Brother Johnson said, had they fired that charge, they would have mowed everything down before them to the earth. So Ellen White gives this account that she didn't want, that God didn't want too many casualties on the sides of the North, even though he was punishing them for slavery. So here we have an account of what would have happened if the angel hadn't raised his arm backward to cause this retreat. So I think it's a pretty interesting account. Okay, so 13 days is the next section. Ellen White's vision occurred only 13 days after the Battle of Manassas. While the significance of any individual battle is usually understood long after the fact, Ellen White was given insight not only to the significance of this battle, but also into heaven's interest and attention to these events. This interest was due to the sin of slavery for which God was punishing the nation. God is punishing this nation for the high crime of slavery. He has the destiny of the nation in his hands. He will punish the South for the sin of slavery and the North for so long suffering its overreaching and overbearing influences. All heaven beholds with indignation human beings, the workmanship of God, reduced to the lowest depths of degradation and placed on a level with the brute creation by their fellow men. And professed followers of that dear Savior, whose compassion was ever moved as he witnessed human woe, heartily engage in this enormous and grievous sin, and deal in slaves and souls of men. Angels have recorded it all. It is written in the book. The tears of the pious bondmen and bondwomen, of fathers, mothers, and children, brothers and sisters, are all bottled up in heaven. Agony, human agony, is carried from place to place and bought and sold. God will restrain his anger but a little longer. His anger burns against this nation, and especially against the religious bodies who have sanctioned and have themselves engaged in this terrible merchandise. Such injustice, such oppression, such sufferings, many professed followers of the meek and lowly Jesus can witness with heartless indifference. And many of them can inflict with hateful satisfaction all this indescribable agony themselves, and yet dare to worship God. It is solemn mockery, and Satan exalts over it and reproaches Jesus and his angels with such inconsistency, saying with hellish triumph, such are Christ's followers. These professed Christians read of the sufferings of the martyrs, and tears course down their cheeks. They wonder that men could ever possess hearts so hardened as to practice such inhuman cruelties toward their fellow men, while at the same time they hold their fellow men in slavery. And this is not all. They sever the ties of nature, and cruelly oppress from day to day their fellow men. They can inflict most inhuman tortures with relentless cruelty, which would well compare with the cruelty papists and heathens exercise towards Christ's followers. It will be more tolerable for the heathen and for the papists in the day of the execution of God's judgment than for such men. The cries and sufferings of the oppressed have reached unto heaven, and angels stand amazed at the hard-hearted, untold, agonizing suffering man in the image of his maker causes his fellow man. The names of such are written in blood, crossed with stripes, and flooded with agonizing, burning tears of suffering. God's anger will not cease until he has caused the land of light to drink the dregs of the cup of his fury. At the Roosevelt Conference, when the brethren and sisters were assembled on the day set apart for humiliation, fasting, and prayer, Sabbath, August 3rd, the Spirit of the Lord rested upon us, and I was taken off in vision and shown the sin of slavery. So this is her second Civil War vision, the August 3rd one. Now, they had set aside or set apart this day, this Sabbath, for humiliation, fasting, and prayer. Now, this is an important point, because one of the things that we looked at and that we noticed once we started studying this had to do with these days of fasting and prayer that the government was giving regarding this Civil War, and what Ellen White says about this. So this becomes a really interesting point. Slavery has long been a curse to this nation. The fugitive slave law was calculated to crush out of man every noble, generous feeling of sympathy that should arise in his heart for the oppressed and suffering slave. It was in direct opposition to the teaching of Christ. God's scourge now is upon the North, that they have so long submitted to the advances of the slave power. The sin of Northern pro-slavery pro-slavery men is great. They have strengthened the South in their sin and sanctioned the extension of slavery and acted a prominent part in bringing the nation into its present distressed condition. I was shown that many realize not the extent of the evil which has come upon us. They have flattered themselves that the national difficulties would soon be settled and confusion and war end. But all will be convinced that there is more reality in the matter than was anticipated. Many have looked for the North to strike a blow and the controversy be ended. I was pointed back to ancient Israel, held in bondage by the Egyptians. The Lord wrought by Moses and Aaron to deliver the children of Israel. Miracles were performed before Pharaoh to convince him that they were especially sent of God to bid him to let Israel go. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened against the messengers of God, and he reasoned away the miracles performed by them. Then the Egyptians were made to feel God's judgments. They were visited by plagues. While suffering under the effect of the several plagues, Pharaoh consented to let Israel go. But as soon as the cause of their suffering was removed, his heart was hardened. His mighty men and counselors strengthened themselves against God and endeavored to explain the plagues as a result of natural causes. Each visitation from God was more severe than the preceding one, yet they would not release the children of Israel until the angel of the Lord slew the firstborn of the Egyptians. From the king upon the throne down to the most humble and lowly was there wailing and mourning. Then Pharaoh commanded to let Israel go. After the Egyptians had buried their dead, Pharaoh relented that he had let Israel go. His counselors and mighty men tried to account for their bereavement. They would not admit that the visitation or judgment was from God, and they pursued after the children of Israel. When the Israelites beheld the Egyptian host in pursuit, some upon horses and some in chariots, and equipped for war, their hearts failed them. The Red Sea was before them, the Egyptian host behind. They could see no way of escape. A shout of triumph burst from the Egyptians to find Israel completely in their power. The Israelites were greatly terrified. The Lord commanded Moses to bid the children of Israel go forward, to lift up the rod and stretch out his hand over the sea and divide it. He did so, and lo, the sea parted, and the children of Israel passed over dry shod. Pharaoh had so long withstood God and hardened his heart against his mighty wondrous works, that he, in his blindness, rushed into the path God had miraculously prepared for his people. Again, Moses was commanded to stretch forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to his strength, and the waters covered the Egyptian host, and they were drowned. This scene was presented before me to illustrate the selfish love of slavery, the desperate measures the South would adopt to cherish the institution, and the dreadful lengths to which they would go before they would yield. The dreadful system of slavery has reduced and degraded human beings to the level of the brutes, and the majority of slave masters regard them as such. Their consciences have become seared and hardened, as was Pharaoh's, and if compelled to release their slaves, their principles are unchanged, and they would make the slave feel their oppressive power if possible. It looked to me like an impossibility now for slavery to be done away. God alone can wrench the slave from the hand of his desperate, relentless oppressor. All the abuse and cruelty exercised toward the slave is justly chargeable to the upholders of the slave system, whether they be Southern men or Northern men. The North and South were presented before me. The North have been deceived in regard to the South. They are better prepared for war than has been represented. Most of their men are well skilled in the use of arms, some of them from experience in battle, others from habitual sporting. They have the advantage of the North in this respect, but have not, as a general thing, the power of endurance and valor that Northern men have. So there's lots of interesting things here that Ellen White brings out. And one of the things is that, the advantages of the South and the advantages of the North. That is, the North have a just cause in this sense, especially many of the people in the North who are opposed to slavery. So there are a number of things we learned from Sister White's insights. The first is that if this evil were not removed from the nation, slavery would crush out of man every noble, generous feeling of sympathy that should arise in his heart. And second, that Sister White could distinguish the significance of the war, especially as it relates to the removal of slavery, is evidence of her divine insight. In regards to the turning point of the American Civil War, the Wikipedia article has insightful comment. At the time of an event, the fog of war often makes it impossible to recognize all of the implications of any specific outcome. Only hindsight can fully reveal the end point and all the developments that led up to it. For this reason, contemporary observers may lack confidence in predicting a turning point. Many of the turning points of the Civil War cited here could not have been recognized as such at the time. Ellen White knew in foresight what many only could know in hindsight. So, any thoughts there? Okay, so let's look at her first Civil War vision. So 90 days prior to the start of the American Civil War, Sister White was shown in advance the extent of the war in a vision given her at Parkville, what's MI again?
Michigan.
Michigan, right. On Sabbath, January 12th, 1861. The account here is given by J.N. Loughborough in his personal recording of Sister White's words. There is not a person in this house who has even dreamed of the trouble that is coming upon this land. People are making sport of the secession ordinance of South Carolina. But I've been shown that a large number of states are going to join that state, and there will be a most terrible war. In this vision, I have seen large armies of both sides gathered on the field of battle. I heard the booming of the cannon and saw the dead and dying on every hand. Then I saw them rushing up, engaged in hand-to-hand fighting, bayoneting one another. Then I saw the field after battle, all covered with the dead and dying. Then I was carried to prisons and saw the sufferings of those in want who were wasting away. Then I was taken to the homes of those who had lost husbands, sons, or brothers in the war. I saw there distress and anguish. Then, surveying her audience, Ellen White slowly added a foreboding note. There are those in this house who will lose sons in that war. This is a remarkable account. South Carolina had seceded on December 20th, 1860. The 3 days before her Parkville vision, a domino progression of states began to secede from the Union. I list the chronology below. So you're going to see South Carolina is the first one. Then on January 9th, 10th, and 11th, and you're going to have these, and I put there the biblical dates. You're going to have 3 of these in order secede. Now, Ellen White, would she have known about this on January 12th?
Very likely.
So you think it's very likely she would have known about what had happened on the 9th, 10th, and 11th when she does this sermon on January 12th?
I think that's very possible, yes.
Okay. Well, maybe she might have heard of Mississippi, but it's going to take time for the news to get to Ellen White of what's actually happening. So I don't know exactly how fast news travels or how, closely James and Ellen White are looking at the papers. But in her vision, she mentions South Carolina. She doesn't mention Mississippi, Florida, and Alabama. So 3 days before her vision, Mississippi secedes. 2 days before Florida secedes, and the day before Alabama secedes.
But in another way, what's kind of interesting as I look at this.
Yeah.
your January 9th, 10th, and 11th, culminating on the 12th with the vision.
Mhm.
I understand your application of the biblical dates, but if you take a symbolic date, you're looking at 9th day of the first month, 10th day of the first month, 11th day of the first month,
Mhm.
with the center being the 10th day of the first month, which is the date where the sacrifice was to be selected.
Mhm. Yeah, and we also, well, January 12th, that's the 12th day of the first month, that's the River Ahava.
Right.
They leave the River Ahava, and it would basically, they're there for 3 days. And so you have 3 days before the 12th day of the first month as well.
Okay.
So we have a period of 3 days there, which, just notice now, but by you pointing that out. So there's definitely significance. And at this time, I wasn't generally looking at our dates and converting them into biblical dates. The odd time maybe, but I don't think it was a general thing that I would have done.
But why, one of the other things that's interesting of this, as you have laid this out, you've got a span of 7 days from January 12th to January 19th, a following 7 days from January 26th or January 19th to the 26th.
Yeah.
So you have 2 periods of 7 days after this vision in which two states choose to secede.
Yeah. No, and so there's lots here, obviously. Now we're going to have the start of the war, as you can see, she has January 12th. The start of the war is going to be April 12th. So by that time, you've had Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. So you have 8 different states secede from the Union. And then they're going to have this Constitution of Confederate States of America drafted. It's basically the American Constitution with just a few changes. And then Jefferson Davis, I don't know how you say his last name, Davis is inaugurated the president of the Constitution or the Confederate States of America. So I put these dates here, just the biblical dates at the time, just for the sake of keeping track of them. And then you have on March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln is inaugurated president of the USA. So that's the 21st day of the 12th month.
So in other words, there's again 14 days between these 2 inaugurations. So we're dealing with another doubling of 7 times.
Yeah. And then we have, of course, the war beginning April 12th, 90 days from Ellen White's first vision. And it's going to be caused by they fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. And that date is the first day of the first month on the biblical calendar. So that becomes extremely significant in that sense. It's a parallel with 9/11. And then April 15th, Lincoln calls for Union troops to retake Fort Sumter. So they're going to take this act as a declaration of war. So some people argue about how you actually start the war. Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee subsequently join the Confederates on the fourth day of the first month. So interesting details there. The significance of all of them, I don't know if we've really understood it all, except that we can see some things that are definitely significant. And the most significant really, for me, is the date that the war starts, the first day of the first month. Now, when we go back to this chart, and the idea here in this study is, as we go through this, is I want to take our time to understand this. And obviously we're going to to continue going back over some of this history here. But you can see that I placed these waymarks above the Ellen White's first three visions. I have her first vision marking the time of the end. Obviously, the first day of the first month is a symbol of 9/11. And so April 12th, 1861 has that 9/11 mark above it. And then July 21st is a symbol of midnight. And then I put August 3rd, 1861 as a symbol of the midnight cry. So whether these things are correct or not, it's just what I did back in 2018. And then I have the Sunday law being her third vision and just putting them on a line. Any thoughts on this?
Some work and some don't.
Okay, what do you mean some work and some don't? So what doesn't work?
Well, midnight, 21st of July,
Yeah.
kind of is, yeah, you can sort of tick that box
Mhm.
on the first day of the first month,
Mhm.
9/11, April 12th. But I'm just thinking it's a bit, there doesn't seem to be any backing up for the midnight cry other than you just sort of saying this is going to be it.
Yeah, I would agree there. So I just basically placed it there. The main thing is I took that there was three visions. And at that time, I'm just looking at the arrival of the first message, the second message, and the third message. Now, of course, the midnight cry is not the arrival of the second message. That would be 9/11. But I'm taking her three visions as symbolizing the three angels' messages. So, so that would be an empowerment of the second angel's message if I'm going to look at January 12th being the time of the end. And then the third message, well, that's October 22nd, 1844. So I'm just marking that as the Sunday law. Now, looking at her third vision, I'm just seeing how much time we have. We can at least touch on it. And we can go over these things again after we've spent some time studying it. Yeah, you had a comment there, Dwight?
Yeah, I do. I'm looking at this. I'm looking at this chart and I'm trying to apply it with the chart that we were addressing in the last couple of weeks about the 187 with the internal 13 days.
Okay.
Now, from what I had first read at the outset with the position taken on July 18th,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to ask the question if there isn't a 187 that we may see on the other side of January 4th, 1862. I recognize that you're looking at these in the visions
Mm-hmm.
and the importance of the visions, but I'm trying to also apply whether this was another example of this type of 187 day or 187 year example that we have been seeing in scripture.
Okay, so just a couple of things to answer that comment. So one is we have now this isn't exactly how we would see the structure in Millerites history, but we do know that when we first had the period from the first day of the first month to the 10th day of the seventh month, Jeff had divided this as a period of 120 days and 70 days. That is, he had a period of 190 days. He didn't take into account that there were some months of 29 days. He took every month as 30 days.
Right.
And he still used that as a symbol because the 120 and the 70, those symbolize the priests and the Levites. Right? Remember that?
Understood.
Okay. So now we do have 190 days from January 12th to the Battle of Manassas. So that 190 is also a symbol of 187
Okay,
because it's a symbol from that we use for the period that's actually 187 days. Now, we also have this period of 54 days or 154 days. Now, from Samuel Snow's first letter, which is written February 16th, and that is published on July 18th, that which contains a prophetic mirror. We sometimes say it's 153. That is, the cardinal count is 153. The ordinal count is 154. So that 154 days, I take as a symbol relating to Samuel Snow's letters. And of course, the last letter is July 18th, which we already have with the 13 days, 18720 minutes from Ellen White's vision and the Battle of Manassas. But then we also know that July 18th is a symbol or an internal symbol that points to October 22nd, 1844. So something about Ellen White's visions here relates to Samuel Snow's letters and relates to Millerite history regarding this Civil War. So we have these symbols. They're not necessarily in the same order, but they're still there. And we also have the number 22 weeks, which is a number of restoration, just like 220 is. 22 years between Joseph's and their fulfillment. Your mic's making a bit of noise, someone. I think it's right. So that was that mic. Okay. So I had to mute a microphone. Now we have here, of course, this other history. And in order to understand this history, the way that I'm going to look at this has to deal with the national fast and the Thanksgiving proclamation and the significance of these dates and these the proclamation itself going into effect and these different fasts. So that's going to be part of the study. Now, back in 2018, we were already studying this prior to the camp meeting in October. So we're gonna do this study in November, and it's going to be like the middle of November, and then finally, we do a study on it on the 21st of November, the day before November 22nd, where we're going to make this prediction about. But it starts here with this Civil War study. But even before that, we were looking at these fast days and these Thanksgivings. So it was something that was being discussed prior to the camp meeting. So it's an interesting point here that we're going to have to look at and what this means. Now, Ellen White's going to comment on this. That is, she's going to talk about this here. So we're going to try to get this done. We just have a few minutes. I don't know how far we'll get, but so this is her third vision. She says, the dreadful state of our nation calls for deep humility on the part of God's people. The one all-important inquiry, which should now engross the mind of everyone, is, am I prepared for the day of God? Can I stand the trying test before me? This is 1 Testimonies 3:55. I saw that God is purifying and proving his people. He will refine them as gold until the dross is consumed and his image is reflected in them. All have not that spirit of self-denial. and that willingness to endure hardness and to suffer for the truth's sake, which God requires. Their wills are not subdued. They have not consecrated themselves wholly to God, seeking no greater pleasure than to do his will. Ministers and people lack spirituality and true godliness. Everything is to be shaken, can be shaken. God's people will be brought into most trying positions, and all must be settled, rooted, and grounded in the truth, or their steps will surely slide. If God comforts and nourishes the soul with his inspiring presence, they can endure, though the way may be dark and thorny. For the darkness will soon pass away and the true light shine forever. I was pointed to Isaiah 58, 1-15, and Jeremiah 14, verse 1-12, as a description of the present state of our nation. Now, Isaiah 58 is the one where it talks about this fast. Cry aloud, spare not, lift up thy voice as a trumpet, show the house of people their transgressions, and the house of Jacob their sins, goes into the fast, and so forth. So she's referring to this fast aspect. And Jeremiah 14, verse 10-12, I can't remember offhand, I did look at it. So she says, or it says in the Bible, I'm not going to switch to it. Thus saith the Lord unto his people, thus have they loved to wander. They have not refrained their feet. Therefore the Lord doth not accept them. He will now remember their iniquity and visit their sins. Then said the Lord unto me, pray not for this people, for their good. When they fast, I will not hear their cry. And when they offer burnt offering and an oblation, I will not accept them. But I will consume them by the sword and by the famine and by pestilence. Both of these are referring to fasts. And you can see why this is significant. She says, they have chosen other gods and followed their own corrupt ways until God has turned from them. The inhabitants of the earth have trampled upon the law of God and broken his everlasting covenant. I was shown the excitement created among our people by the article in the review headed The Nation. Some understood it one way and some another. The plain statements were distorted and made to mean what the writer did not intend. He gave the best light that he then had. It was necessary that something be said. The attention of many was turned to Sabbath keepers because they manifested no greater interest in the war and did not volunteer. In some places, they were looked upon as sympathizing with the rebellion. The time had come for our true sentiments in relation to slavery and the rebellion to be made known. There was need of moving with wisdom to turn away the suspicions excited against Sabbath keepers. We should act with great caution. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. We can obey this admonition and not sacrifice one principle of our faith. Satan and his hosts are at war with the commandment keepers and will work to bring them into trying positions. They should not, by lack of discretion, bring themselves there. Now, an interesting point is the new movement, the Omega, co-opted this. Would we agree with that?
I won't disagree.
Yeah. So they, when Tess starts presenting the Civil War, she starts presenting it in the context of there's going to be no Sunday law. And what she tries to argue is that the Sunday law for us is going to be the issue about human liberty. Specifically, Black Lives Matters, LGBTQ, plus, plus, plus. So, and their arguments are on the surface convincing. That is, Ellen White in 1863 has not written The Great Controversy. She has not talked about the National Sunday Law yet at this point. And if Christ could have come in 1863, there wouldn't have been in Ellen White's writings any indication of a national Sunday law. The Sunday law that she speaks of prior to 1884, when she first talks about a national Sunday law, is the Sunday law that happens after the close of probation. And so they start to make this argument that we're going to go back to this time. Now, there's lots of problems with it, but on the surface, you can see here that the issue was slavery and human liberty. And so they try to take this parallel here. Now, we can see that Ellen White is making a parallel here with the Civil War, that in some ways, that it is connected to the coming Sunday law. We can now look back and see this. But I think that's what's happening here in this, because God could not have come back in the United States with slavery still in place. And that this is something that has to be cleaned up for the United States, for the message of the Advent movement, the message of the third angel to go. There's this issue that the United States has, and it's slavery. So there's something here that we haven't really plumbed the depths of, but the waters have also been muddied by what has gone before. And this is an important point, because often what happens is that Satan, and I've said this many, many times, but he will mix truth with error. And he does this for two reasons. One is to make error more palatable, but the other is to obscure the truth so that we'll throw the baby out with the bathwater. And some of the things that were being brought in by Parminder and Tess were true, but they were mixed with error. And we have to know how to separate the precious and the vile. And we have Miller's rules to guide us in this. And this is what we are doing right now in this movement, is Satan has brought an attack against the truth. And this attack has hardened people's hearts against the truth because of its association with error. So we know Seventh-day Adventists, they are abolitionists. They are opposed to slavery right from the very inception. And yet it's going to be this Black Lives Matters, which is a posturing or actually a using or misuse of this issue to really bring about a Sunday law. I'm not really stating myself clearly, but you can see the issues are connected. And there is this obscuring of these issues by mixing them with error that we have to really dig to understand. Now, I'm going to stop there. So we're going to finish this part off tomorrow, and we're going to look at what she's talking about in relation to why she brings up this fast. So it's quite interesting. Any final comments before we close with prayer?
So far, this has been a very intriguing groundwork of this study.
Yeah, and I still think that we're going to find a lot of things that we missed as we go through this. And I'm giving it sort of a week, but who knows? We may find that there's a lot more that we have to take time to go through. Okay, so thanks for all the conversations. Let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful for the time that we have, this precious time that you've given us to study, to share, to listen to your voice, to be guided by your Spirit, to dig deep into your word, into the spirit of prophecy, into history. And we know, Lord, our minds are weak. They're weakened because of sin, because of our lack of exercise, for our laziness. And we know, Lord, that these things do not come easily, and that we have to spend time studying and praying and searching for truth. But we know, Lord, that you are there, to help us, to guide us, and to bring the things to our remembrance that we need. And so we ask for your continued help this week in this study and throughout this day. Thank you, Lord, for hearing our prayer. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.